Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Vermont Film Essentials. I have some special guests with us. So as the black sheep of the group, I'm like the Paul Giamatti of this band right here. You guys are the musicians and we're here to talk about music and film and what we love about it and what you guys love about seeing yourselves represented on the screen, if they achieve it or not. And I, as the black sheep, am like the filmmaker wanting to get what you guys do on the screen, and sometimes feeling like I fall short, or is there really a way to get what you guys do on screen correctly? So, Devin, why don't you introduce our special guest here?
Sure. So we've got Mr. Jamie Bright right over here, and Jared Coons, two musicians. I'm not going to say from Vermont because they're from Earth. Okay, we are all here, and anyway, yeah. What do you think?
What do you guys think? Because I feel like what I love about watching movies about musicians and movies about music is, it's about capturing a feeling, right? It's about the feeling of what it's like to write a song, to perform a song. To feel the music in your veins and have that be the joy and passion that is running through you. And the problem with a movie is you have to see everything. It's not as well equipped to show a feeling. So what do you think is special about movies about music that you guys love?
I think when they're done well, in the same way I run a recording studio, and in the same way that I love making records because it's right there in the name. You're recording a moment in time. And I think when it's executed effectively, it captures those feelings. And film as a medium is very conducive to showing and telling in a way that you don't get the visual element necessarily with an album. But the things that kind of take me out of a lot of biopics or music movies are really glaring bad miming an instrument or bad lip syncing or something. It's that person is not playing that guitar part. That is not at all what those chords would sound like.
Yep.
So when that stuff is done and it kind of the illusion is pulled off effectively, you can get super immersed in it. And I think that those are the most, even if you're a non-musician watching it, I think it translates and kind of sucks you in a cool way. That thing you do, all of the actors in the band took individual lessons for a month before they shot a single frame. And then they had band rehearsals where they actually played along to the extent that a lot of the extras didn't realize that they were playing to a track. They thought the band was performing it live because it was so convincing. So stuff like that where it's oh, you got the drum fill just right. You're okay, cool. It allows you to kind of lift that suspension of disbelief and just live in the moment and enjoy it.
I love that you wanted to talk about that movie because I think it's one of those movies that no one talks about, and I think it's such a great feel-good movie in its own right, but as a movie about musicians and what it's like to be a musician, I think one of the scenes that resonates with me is when they first hear their song on the radio, and everyone's running in,
turning the radios
the
on.
Choreography of it, and that scene is a feeling. It's the feeling of hearing your voice coming back through the radio, and they capture it so well.
Yeah. You just reminded me of The Doors, Oliver Stone. I heard this story once. I'm just going to assume that it's the story, but that when they were figuring out how they were going to do the music for that Val Kilmer submitted a demo, or maybe submitted said to the director or whatever, to Oliver Stone, these are the songs I want to do. Is that cool? And I want to sing, And he didn't tell him, and he listened, and he said, well, okay, let me hear what you can do with those songs. And he's yeah, that was me singing on those songs. And he was oh, okay.
All right, so you're singing.
Yeah, so I think as far as the
convincing,
whenever whether it was Jamie Foxx or whoever, I think that the most important thing is that you have somebody, whether it's a musician's life or it's Johnny Depp doing Blow or whatever it is, shouldn't you be studying the character and wanting to embody the character. And I think because there's this like really thin thread between the music and film world, it's like how many actors kind of just automatically consider themselves musicians, right? But the musician always gets kind of like junked on, like, oh, you can't act.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like whenever, for me, what kills a movie that's about a musician or music in general is exactly that, when you kind of have this person that just assumes they can
Pull
do
it off.
yeah.
Because they're dramatic.
It's so dramatic.
But,
That's what it ends up being.
You know,
It's like,
to touch on what you said, two movies that stick out to me in that regard is The Cotton Club, Francis Ford Coppola. Richard Gere learned to play the flugelhorn and like play it well, like he plays everything in the film. And also, the title escapes me right now, but the Jimi Hendrix biopic that Andre 3000
Right.
did,
Side or something,
he almost quit because he was like, I have to learn how to play guitar with my other hand as well as Jimi Hendrix. Like, and he almost quit, and then he pulls it off. And he's also a dynamic musician, songwriter in his own right, but it's like Jimi Hendrix is, you know, Paul McCartney said was the greatest guitarist of all time, for God's sake. So it's like, it's daunting, but once again, when you have a musician like who can act, you definitely have an advantage in accuracy.
yeah, and don't you think there's a vibration? Like, that's always what kills me. If when the first moment you meet the actor that's going to kind of try and fill these shoes, just in the face, that's all it is to me. If the vibration in the face is different, it's like, I can't even watch it.
Well, that's what makes actors who don't necessarily look completely like the person they're playing come through with the character, because it's like, it is so much with intention and understanding the essence of the
The
person.
nuances of that character or that person.
That's why, like, you brought up The Doors, and I can remember so clearly when that movie came out, and I was way not the age that I should have been watching that movie. but my brother got into a heavy Doors phase, and he had the poster of Jim Morrison on his door, and the image of Val Kilmer as Jim Morrison on the poster for the movie was everywhere at that point, and I was like, oh, that's Val Kilmer. Like, that's like one, to this day, I think it's just one big, great magic trick that he was able to pull that off.
And to me, didn't that kind of kick it off? Like, really, for the age of the biopic about, I mean, to me, I'm trying to think of like what was before that really went that.
You got Sissy Spacek as Loretta Lynn,
Coal Miner's
daughter. It definitely was a thing. It was just maybe not quite as like
That kind of blew the doors down.
right, and that opened the door. That opened the door for so many. Yeah.
I think like the fact that it was Oliver Stone at that moment, right after Platoon, right after Born on the 4th of July, and then I think he made that in JFK in the same year. How? But like it was like the one time where like a big cinematic director was taking this on. It was like kind of like what Scorsese did with The Band, with The Last Waltz. It was like, oh, this can be a very dynamic cinematic medium that's successful.
I think Bird preceded that, right?
Yep.
Which is a great.
That was
great
before
flick.
that?
Yeah,
Oh,
I think
okay.
88 maybe.
Okay.
But that was a dynamic performance as well, and really that's when you're tackling so much more than just the music. You're really capturing what went into making that specific human being that would be capable of such music.
That makes me think too, Devin, that the one thing that for me, when I get an album, the first thing I do is go to YouTube and go to Wikipedia, and I try and learn as much as I can about who the artist is, because that to me is really what lets
That's why
lets me
whenever
hear the
I tell
song
you about a
properly.
band, Jamie, you always are like, where are they from? And you start asking me all these questions about them. I'm like, I don't know yet. I just listened to the album. And I recently have become more like you, to be honest.
Well, so I think when you watch a film, one of the things that really drives me nuts is when the film is about what we already know. Mm-hmm. Showing a musician in the light of like, oh, he played this big gig and that big. I'm like,
we don't need to see that
I
stuff
wanna know,
recreated. Yeah.
I want to know about the conversation that was, the first kind of like crack in the foundation between like the guitarist and the drummer, and so you can watch the dynamic. It's like, oh, here we go. People are going to start taking sides, and then it's going to be because what's so cool about that thing you do is they really nailed from friends in the garage to the end. Like, I mean, I can only assume that this is the nature of the universe of that kind of hierarchy and dynamic, but that story is not few and far between. It's pretty much
universal.
That's what made the Brian Wilson
Love and Mercy.
movie.
I was
What
going to
made
bring that up. It's
so incredible
perfect.
is because you really, everyone feels like they know about the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson, but it's like, no, like how did this genius, what was it like to come up with all this stuff and
quit touring and it's his
and the
relatives
burden
and
of
friends
genius,
And I also think it's important in that particular case to be able to sit in the shoes of Mike Love, where it's like we never get to see the perspective of second best.
Right.
You
think about
it's
like,
sometimes
the
a more
Beatles.
interesting story.
It is.
Right?
You think about the Beatles and it's like George Harrison is one of the world's greatest songwriters. And he's third fiddle to Lennon and McCartney. It's like, how do you rectify that feeling of being like, I'm not good enough? It's
where's
like,
the definitive Beatles movie, by the way? Anyway.
Right.
There should be one.
Right?
It really is, man. I mean, there are so many parallels. Another thing that's really cool about that movie is how they just nailed the music. Like Adam Scheslinger, I think his name is. He's the frontman for Fountains of Wayne. Stacey's mom. He wrote all those tunes, and like Tom Hanks has some songwriting credits too. Like I think he helped with like lyrics and stuff. But just the perfect channeling of that early like 63, 65 era Beatles stuff.
Yeah.
All the turnarounds, the little chord kind
the
of
fact
changes
that the
you're like,
drummer's the jazz guy. He's kind
and
of.
they replaced the bass player like the Beatles did, and they replaced the drummer like the Beatles did, and Brian Epstein, who managed the Beatles, was kind of the source of Tom Hanks' character. Like he's completely modeled after that. Like we're putting you in suits. Like this is what we're gonna do. And the
Oneaters, that's right.
The Ed Sullivan show, when the Beatles first played Ed Sullivan, John Lennon had just gotten married and to his first wife Cynthia, and they said like, sorry girls, he's married, and then they tease that when they play on the TV show and that thing you do, and it says caution girls, he's engaged, and it's a total nod to the Beatles. It's
That's
like
great.
The level of kind of detail and obsessive nerdery. I'm a huge Beatles fan, but I'm like, I see what you did there,
and
Tom
they probably
Hanks.
did that on purpose because what happens if you? I mean, it's kind of we were talking about this with the Marvel movies and stuff like that. It's like you can't alienate a fan base like that, and you're never gonna really do okay with the Beatles because there's so many conflicting. Because these are real lives. It's not like if you follow the comic, you follow the comic, and you can make people happy. There's like, are you a Lennon guy or a McCartney guy? And then that completely changes.
the
You kind of have to make two movies.
And that's what makes it interesting, though, is I think it's great when you see one thing from a certain perspective, and then someone else comes out with there. It's like, no, you looked at it from this point of view. It's like so many different stories to tell from these.
That's why with recently with Straight Outta Compton, I think like I liked the movie, but two just little issues I had was one, it didn't feel like they picked who they were going to follow, that they tried to do everyone.
Didn't give it an angle.
I think the performances really elevated.
Oh
that
yeah.
I mean,
and there was a little bit of the, well, I already know this story. Let's go a little deeper into to what really happened. But I think of putting you back in that time in the late 80s and early 90s, I think it did an amazing job.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes with as far as telling the story, how you write, because that's, as an avid reader of the biographies and watching the documentaries and doing the whole thing, I think about a movie like that and wonder where do you set the gauge for what the public knowledge is? Because there's always going to be nerds. They're like, I already knew that, I already knew, But
then there's people that show up and they're like, wow, I didn't know any of that, and it's really new to them.
That's why I'm thinking in the case of that, because it's hip-hop, maybe, And I can't think of, are there other films like that that are based in hip hop?
Oh yeah.
There was the Biggie biopic. the
Yeah, I mean, if
Tupac
you're
one.
talking biopics, but
Yeah, I
there have
guess.
been so many great hip hop films like Juice and
Well, but I was thinking that's what I meant.
Who's
More
the
about
Man?
the biopic, like
Right,
the
right, right, right,
specific,
right.
you know. And I feel like the Biggie, those ones are always,
they
they're
weren't
not
very
about the
su-
career.
they weren't very
they're-
successful.
Well, they're not
or
about the career.
particularly
They're about the
well-made.
incident.
Yeah.
You know, like let's lead up to the incident.
Right. Yeah. Right.
But that one in particular is like, let's follow the success and failures of, you know, this journey of guys or whatever. But I'm wondering if with hip hop, it just seems like, I don't know. I feel the same way about hip hop that I do about the grunge era. It was like such an exploitive thing.
You know, Gus
know,
Van
like-
Sant made a pretty interesting Kurt Cobain film.
Right.
Last Days.
Right.
Because he didn't really try to say, "Hey, this is Kurt Cobain's life." Like he really
Right.
did like an artistic kind of
Yeah.
take on it. You know.
I don't think in
I
that
don't think
movie
he
does
ever
he
really
say
says, no,
anything. Yeah,
no.
he doesn't have one line.
but it's
that's-
blatant. you
Yeah,
know?
but that's again, right? Okay, so back to your initial point, what kind of, as musicians or whatever, I liked that movie. But to me, that movie is, it's really just that. It's like an art piece. The Last Days, right? I just said before with the Biggie thing, like to me, when all you're doing is taking 2 hours to lead up to the incident, you know, the legend moment.
Right.
You know, for me, that's kind of like, if I were Kurt Cobain, you just basically made my whole life about that. That was my life. Like, this is it. Like, I had a drug addiction and then killed myself. You know, so that would be another thing where I think what I love is to meet the person and to go on the journey with the person, not the music. I don't care about the musician. I know all about the musician. There's plenty about the music. I want to know, who was that guy or girl? Like, who are they?
What's their deal?
What's the like Amy Winehouse would be an amazing. I
That
feel like,
did you see that movie?
Oh, they did one.
The Amy documentary, yeah.
Oh,
it's,
but not a biopic.
no, it was
Yeah.
just straight documentary and heartbreaking. I mean,
Yeah.
we know how that ended, but it was really, really well done.
That's
And-
why I'm almost thinking that perhaps the music documentary is the best venue for that type of that story,
Right.
rather than a biopic.
Right, because there's
'Cause
already so much footage typically.
Right. And like, I don't know, like I go back and forth because one of the things that I think is a pitfall of a film is that they have to, for the sake of time and pacing, they have to make a lot of shortcuts.
Right.
So that scene about writing the song takes 2 minutes when you know, there's more to writing a song
Right.
than just that, right?
Right.
But
Unless
then,
there's not.
right,
Yeah,
or,
sometimes
right.
it just happens. But yeah, no, totally.
But then you get great moments like
Yeah.
in The Doors when they're when
When they're in
he
the
pulls out
rehearsing, Light My
break
Fire or
on
whatever.
right.
Yeah.
And to this day, like I can't listen to that song without going G-A-D.
Yeah.
And then even in Walk the Line, like
One film that really tries to capture the essence of a person is Sid and Nancy.
Yep.
I really love that, and it really allowed Gary Oldman to explore the character and what
Right.
it meant to be Sid Vicious,
Right.
who apparently, it's like didn't even play.
Yeah.
It
He's a
just-
character.
He was
So
just
messed up they
there
would- they
to
would
like
turn his
be
bass amp
right,
off.
and it's like, which is a
He didn't
whole,
know how to play the
it's a whole other element of music.
Yeah.
Of the character and the presence and what you bring to it.
That's such an interesting. I feel like Sex Pistols too is such an interesting. Like to me, that was like a genius that knew the formula of the Beatles and was like, I don't care about anything but being famous. I'm just literally going to take this formula and as fast as
Yeah,
possible
fast and
manifest
loud,
it,
yeah.
and then disappear and let its legend. But this is my whole thing though, and I say this as like, probably as a father, I get a little weirded out about the films that are all about the tragedy, like it's just the like.
Well, it's a tale as old as time, too. I mean, you have to
Right.
understand that there is an allure to the tortured artist thing, and that is an inherently romantic as tragic as it is, it's
But
a
the
romanticized
torture to me
idea.
isn't the end, right?
No.
The torture is
But
the
it's not-
journey.
it's not all-
That's what
it's
I'd like
not
to
all
see.
the
I'd like
end.
to
Yeah.
be like, who did what? Like, where are my markers throughout that cat's life? Like, I wouldn't even mind if it was a biopic or a documentary or whatever. That if it just kind of like, when you get to see those timelines of like a country or something like that, like jump, you know, show me that and then go, because that to me is the pattern of life, right? It's like the repeated failures and the repeated, because to me, what's so funny about being a musician and seeing musicians' lives, it's like most of the biggest successes
Yeah.
are followed by this thing that they think is what is going to end their
Well,
career.
and how many of them were still working at like the copy shop
Right.
at 31,
Right.
and delivering? You know, it's like I really feel like there are those stories, and it would be more interesting sometimes for an audience to be able to relate to those types
That's
of
my
things.
point. That's
Yes.
that's my point. It's like, do we want to like highlight and make it all about the end of the tortured artist, or maybe give some insights along the path to be like, yo, don't take yourself so seriously, because once it starts to happen, now you got, I mean, because you have to manage that.
Sure.
You
I think
know?
that's one of the coolest things about Love and Mercy was like the dual narrative, jumping back and forth between,
Yes.
you know, him writing this stuff and then him in the 80s like dealing with his mental health and all that other stuff, like crazy.
And it
period.
provided such an insight into his future state because of the way his father treated him,
Right.
just the nature of his upbringing. You know?
It wouldn't have worked in a more linear fashion, of
Right,
like just
absolutely.
starting with that and then it just becomes a real sad movie, you know?
Yeah,
And that's a character study, and that's when you've chosen to make it a character study rather than an overall kind of encapsulation of the group, you know. So it all comes out of the screenplay. I think.
Yeah, and
Sure.
I was holding off. I was looking at the clock to see how long it would take before we did walk the line. I was really trying not to, you know.
You didn't want to. You didn't
I
want to be the
push
one.
it too quick. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, that one, you know, Reese Witherspoon. To me,
She's
like,
great. I think
you
that's where
get
she
that
truly
you
proved how great she
really,
was.
to me, that
Yeah.
that won me over.
Yeah.
But you got both stories.
Yeah.
And when they come for the visit to just try and like have a I think it was Thanksgiving, and he like, you know, his dad comes over and it just turns into a mess, you know, and that's like, to me, that is the meat and potatoes that I want to be at the dinner table when kind of the whole family falls apart, you know, because you never, that's not really in a lot of the narratives. Like, I mean, even with like the Doors, it was, did they even talk? They didn't talk anything really. I mean, it's like they just had the flashbacks of like the family drive.
Right.
But I don't feel like they talk really about his dad. And if you like read the books and stuff, his dad was like a naval officer that like bounced them all over. You know, that would have been cool to get a
Yeah.
little more of. You know?
Well, it's
Yeah,
like
they kinda-
Paul McCartney has a brother. You never hear about that guy.
Well, you know, I feel like
I didn't even know.
What's
that.
his deal?
Just one music film that I wanted to throw in there because it doesn't usually get mentioned, is Amadeus.
Oh, yeah.
Because whether it's fiction or not,
Right.
it has a lot of those great moments, and that it's from the point of view of the guy that never got famous, but is looking at the
Second
person that got
best.
famous, is saying like, why him and not me? It's just, and there's so many wonderful moments where it just shows you how that fractured, tortured artist and what they can get driven to.
I love that, because that's what we were saying earlier. That is like my ultimate. It's like you're seeing it through the eyes of second best, you know. Because even the famous person to me feels second best to something,
Sure.
and that's what actually gives them.
The drive
Yeah.
to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you get to actually experience it from that kind of, because I feel like what's so funny is that it's all strategic from the standpoint of management and the executive branch of these arts, of who gets to be like that in the Wonders. That's like, or that thing you do. That's like the Oneaters. That's the perfect aspect that you get to have, is that it's clearly all about this guy,
Yeah.
and he can't really handle it. He kind of goes through this whole thing, and you get to see that transformation of like, it's about me.
You made me realize that it's like there's all these movies that are not about people who actually lived and are just about musicians and characters that are musicians, like Crazy Heart, which is so good, and about about the person who's not crazy famous, but has just been doing it and is an accomplished musician and deals with all these things, but it's not like exploited because it didn't actually happen. So it's just like, no, this is just this guy's life and what's happening. And that movie owes a lot to Tender Mercies, which is also a just great exploration into songwriting and just how it's like inextricable from life when you're really a true songwriter.
And when you're, practicing what you preach, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Like,
What was that? Exactly. What was that movie that like blew up for a short period of time? That was
Titanic.
There was a band playing on the Titanic while it sunk. Okay,
it's relevant.
This is so bad. But he wrote that like one-hit tune, and they called he was like the Bob Dylan, but they found him way later in Chicago.
Inside
Llewyn Davis.
Yeah.
No,
You're thinking about the guitar player?
Yes, that ended up. He was famous in South Africa.
Searching for
That's
Sugar
a
Man
documentary.
Yeah, Searching for Sugar Man.
Yeah. He was great.
That just made me think of those fictitious stories or the movies that you're saying. But that is so awesome. That movie, because people. I mean, how can you not?
Yeah.
Just love that story.
Yeah, I know.
Absolutely.
Everybody wants that. Everyone wants the Susan
That just
Boyle
doesn't
thing.
happen.
There's an amazing.
Just compared him to Susan Boyle.
I did. This is a little bit of a tangent, but there's a really, really great, I think it's on Showtime, Mike Judge series called Tales from the Tour Bus. And it's all about country musicians from the 70s, and all of them have passed away. But he does all these interviews with people that like their manager, their partners, their bandmates, whatever, their next door neighbor. And they tell all these true stories that I'm sure it's kind of like a game of telephone where it's like snowballed and the legend has gotten so insane, but like then they superimpose animation on top of like actual footage of the people, and then you watch this whole thing. It's like 30-minute episodes, and it's like George Jones and Waylon Jennings and Johnny Paycheck and all these people that you know and people that you don't, but at the end of every episode they like take the animation away and you see the actual person that they've interviewed. And it's every single one is kind of that, practicing what you preach sort of thing, where like they're living super hard and people shooting people and in and out of jail and all these absurd stories. But it's really, really interesting to kind of see that type of a narrative presented as like a true story with the people that knew it, that lived it, and. That's, I think, kind of the most difficult thing to navigate with the biopic or documentary, where it's like I want to leave like an emotional will of like people that know what the heck they're talking about. It's like, oh no, don't listen to that person. They don't, this person,
please, that's hysterical.
You knew me when,
Yeah.
So that is always so interesting to me, to see the way that someone's life story is handled in the context of their art and in the way that they lived. And who they were.
Well, because in the music business, this is what I was thinking when you were talking about how much time. I mean, there's no real legends that you would even want to make a story about that didn't. It takes a really long time.
Right.
Even if you were playing in kind of bigger things or whatever, to really become like the quote unquote household name. Most of these things that we're talking about are people that had some legendary death, and the movie was made like at least 10 years or 20 years later.
The ones who become famous overnight usually are not worth their weight in gold.
But that's
so
what
there
I'm
was
saying,
something that just happened, and their music became famous, and then it's just like they don't have the legitimacy to sustain.
There's also
a
just
career
a
like
very, very interesting thing with the fragmentation of how people consume music and everything, any type of media or information, that like we're never going to have a Michael Jackson again, because you think about the timing of MTV music videos. They're playing his music video every 20 minutes, all day long, and that's the only place you can see music videos. So then you get this just market saturation of like, he's bigger than life because he is, and that's like, now you go on YouTube and you can watch anything you want at any time, and I think it's beautiful, and like kind of the democracy of hopefully the stuff that rises to the top is worth its attention. But you can listen. You just look at like streaming platforms alone. You've got a dozen different options, and it's like cool. Just because you can dominate like one segment of the market, it's not ever, in my opinion, going to be that level of like immense superstar thing. Record labels can throw money at whoever they want all day long and put them on TV and put them, on billboards and stuff.
Yeah.
But
I love thinking about that. You just made me think about if Michael Jackson, as the kid, were alive during this. It's like he probably would have ended as like some just YouTube kid that was like a sensation,
singing covers or something.
And then it was kind of over because it's like, oh, great cop,
Here's
but
someone,
to have
here's
the
someone who's
longevity,
younger.
Yeah.
Like, here's another 8-year-old kid who's got a great voice or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, because that to me, and this because the Michael Jackson thing, or the Jacksons or whatever, that was like, they did like 8, was that
There was
8
a mini
episodes?
series. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, talk about taking your time to have to really show it all.
Right. Well, and he's someone in particular who would not have been what he was if it weren't for the very specific set of circumstances that created the psychological sort of split that he had to do in order to be like, I'm just going to hide in this corner of myself and nourish this light that I have, because there's so much just weight and stress and this and that invading him at all times. So it's like sort of forced him to elevate to this like godlike
and
being,
become a perfectionist of like one of the best singers, dancers, performers of all time.
Often duplicated and never
What was the last that film that was about the end of his life?
This is it. Yeah.
That was amazing.
Heartbreaking. I mean, you're watching this dude who's he can barely function, and then 2, 3, 4, and he's like nailing the choreography. And like you look at him, you're like, this guy's a zombie. Like, what's happening?
Yeah, and that was my favorite part about it. That was my favorite part about it, was his sense of awareness, as if he had like eyes on the back of his head. Like, how did you know that the dancer behind you on the left missed a step?
The best is,
and then he wants to go and show the best, but he also wants to help. That was the thing that blew my mind. He was like, "That was horrible, and you're not very good, but this is how you do it, and you're gonna be great."
Right, he just cares about quality.
There's that one shot with Orianthi or whatever her name is, the lead guitar player who was playing with him at the time, and he's like, "Just play this note," and like sings it, and it's like way up on like the 24th fret, like the highest string. And you're like, wow, dude, you don't even play an instrument, but you know exactly what everyone's doing, and you know exactly how it's supposed to be.
Well, they say that's what Kubrick was like. He knew the characters so well that he could like act it out to the actor, and they're like, oh, that's exactly what I need to be doing, because he's not an actor, but he knew it so well that like can just express it.
Yeah, you need that.
Way. Well, and even like the Shining stuff, like the psychological, we can get into the morality of it, but the psychological kind of manipulation with like Shelley Duvall or whatever, where like he created a hostile environment so as to get the performance that he wanted out of her. She's like losing her hair because she's so stressed out.
I mean, we could tie it back into the music with Bjork. Bjork said she will never do another film again because Lars von Trier just really just made her psychologically kind of unravel. And it created a great performance, but there are costs to that.
Sure.
Can I ask if because that transition was something that I don't know if we wanted to go here, but I really wanted to go here, because The Shining was kind of the perfect thing where like music in films too.
That's great.
Please.
Yeah, because for me, when you first started talking and you asked about what as a musician, do you want to see, I actually at first thought that maybe you were referring to that as somebody who provides music for a film too, because to me, that as an art form, like the more and more I was thinking about films from that perspective to come here, like Kill Bill just like would not stop repeating in my mind. And it's kind of one of these things where it creates this whole other marriage, and I recently watched Birdman.
Yeah.
So good.
And all the extras, huge extras fan, and watching the drummer talk about the process of how they did that, of how they made that, and it was funny to watch to watch and check in with other people that had watched it, and how many people don't even know that it's just drums. And when you realize how many people don't even pick up on that, you're like,
Sure.
success!
Yeah,
I mean, crushed it.
The illusion
Have you
worked,
watched
yeah.
Baby Driver yet?
I was just going to bring that up.
Because you should watch it, because they use music in a way that is just like, it fuels the entire pacing of the movie.
Right.
It's like a musical, but an action musical. It's really hard.
It's like a heist movie, and then
Yeah.
the amount of like choreography and planning, I can't even think about.
It's
the
rhythmic.
the
It's
stunt
rhythmic.
drivers and
Yeah.
stuff in this
As
movie.
an extras person, then you got to watch how they did it because
Okay.
it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, because this transition happened because of The Shining, and I remember being a little kid, and I was thinking about this too. I was like, horror movies cannot do anything without the music element. You know?
Yeah, I mean, what would The Shining be without that Penderecki score? I mean, and that he listened to it and was like, oh, that's perfect. I'll just put
Yeah,
that
and when
in
you look
there.
at like Hitchcock films too, it's the same thing. It's
Yeah.
like it completely curates this emotional response, like dissonant kind of sustaining, weird, scary violins or whatever,
Oh,
just
and
make you
think
feel
of
a certain
Think
way.
of Taxi Driver, and like, you know, just the way that feels when he's driving through the night, with like the way it accompanies the cinematography and becomes one moment. It's like they're not independent from each other, you know.
And sometimes it's a particular artist or musician, and sometimes it's just a composer picking the right instrument. It's
Right.
like we talked about it with Chinatown, like Jerry Goldsmith and the trumpet.
Right.
If that trumpet's not there, it's not really. It's part of the DNA of Chinatown when we watch
the
it.
electronic music in Forbidden Planet too is like, you know, really can change the whole the complexion of the films.
Well, because when
Sound.
we're walking through our day, the eyes are just half. You know, I mean, we don't have like the ability to taste through movies or anything, you know, but our senses
yet.
really not yet. Well, of course, but the ears, if you don't have that piece, I mean, there's so much memory that to me is created through the sounds of things.
Right.
You know, just like the sense of smell or whatever, that I feel like, you know, I was born in Manhattan. I grew up so close to New York City. Whenever I see a movie about New York City, that's like the first thing that calls my attention, is like, yeah, that doesn't sound like New York to me. So no matter how you do the scene, if the combination, because in New York City, there are 25 songs being played simultaneously, and when you turn a corner, you know,
Mixed James.
Well, you
Yeah.
made me think of the first Ninja Turtles, and just like the way it feels to like look at a New York City street corner with like the hip hop blaring from a boombox,
Exactly.
the foot soldiers and all. And but I was thinking of Taxi Driver. Apparently, the story goes that the way they came up with the line, "Are you talking to me?" is that Scorsese and De Niro, it might be a little different, but what I heard was that they were at a Bruce Springsteen concert, and that Springsteen was like everyone's like cheering. It's like, "Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me? You must be talking to me, because I don't see anyone else standing here." And I guess they like looked at each other and were like, "What?"
De Niro's like,
That's it.
"Got
They
it."
knew that was it. Which
That's
is kind of cool.
amazing.
You know?
There's also the wonderful thing that can happen is when, like I can't listen to Cat Stevens without thinking of Harold and Maude. I can't listen to Tiny Dancer without thinking of Almost Famous. And like right now at my work, all of a sudden they'll play like there's just this random music and Harry Nilsson Jump Into the Fire
Love
comes
Harry
on.
Nilsson.
And whenever I hear that, I'm like, I'm Ray
hear about
Liotta,
him.
I'm in my car, I've got a helicopter chasing me, I'm all, I see Goodfellas, like I can't separate,
Totally.
like the music
So
cannot be separated from the movie moment. And there's so many different ways it can happen. It can be the director who is just like Martin Scorsese or Cameron Crowe, who's like digging into his records and is like, these are my favorite songs, I hope you like them too. And then there's just that perfect marriage of, I know exactly who I want to compose this movie, and they're gonna do it, and
You just made me think of Randy Newman.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
You know, the guy who pretty much like flipped the concept of songwriting on its head and was like, "No, I'm just gonna be completely sarcastic about
I
it."
can't think of Randy Newman without thinking of Major League.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay,
I just
working
think-
class.
I think Toy
movie
Story,
is sarcastic.
okay?
But that
Toy
whole
Story all
movie
day.
is sarcastic. Do you know what I mean? So it's like he does.
Am I the only one that thinks of Pleasantville?
Yeah, right. But I mean, yeah, I have tried to write songs in the vein of like Randy Newman, and I wonder sometimes, like, because this is a thing that I think speaks to your point about the classical music and kind of grabbing it, is that there's something in the ether that we're all, in any art form, you know, it's kind of there, and we're just kind of trying to pull it through our own vessel.
Sieve.
And to me, when I think about classical composition, and I think about these composers that didn't have a visual and were really so focused on creating a visual vibration through sound, that's why so many of the movies, like, you know, a film score for most movies is, you know, just pretty much right in there as a classical kind of form.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, when people would, you see some of the directors that see a scene and they already hear the piece of music,
Yep.
that to me is kind of a marriage that, you know, when as a musician, when I see that, I start like either laughing hysterically or being like, you know, it's like when you see Michael Jordan dunk from the foul line, you're like, oh man, I can't, you know, that's how it feels for me when I'm watching a film that ruins a song. That's kind of how, what you're saying, like, yeah, it's like, it really does, like, you know, that's why I want to do more with Amadeus in this conversation, because I think that the way that they took the narrative of the film and took his music and kind of matched the timeline,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Like when they get to his Requiem and every time you're there with Salieri and he's working it out, it's
Yeah.
like, wow!
Yeah, there's two great moments in that. One is when, during the Requiem, when he's trying to communicate, like, it's like, no, don't you hear it? Like, write this. And then there's the moment where he gets it and then you hear it come in.
Yes.
And he's like, oh, I got
That's
it,
the
I hear it.
enlightening thing.
And then the other moment is when he doesn't know who he is yet.
Right.
Or no, he just found out who that is, and then he sees the music and he's looking at it and he's like, it was like this is the voice of God. I'm hearing
Right.
the voice of God. And he's like, first it was so simple, it was just like an oboe.
That's like a
And then it's
narration that happens during
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think knowing music theory, for anybody who doesn't, in that movie in particular, you know, my music theory teacher in high school made a point to say, and this is pretty dissing of like Salieri and those kinds of cats, but he was like, music theory is not how to write music, it's the study of how music was written. So when you realize that, this Salieri was so caught up in the rules, you know, that he still couldn't see it because he's like, broken rule. No, you can't do that. You can't do that.
Right,
You can't do
that's
that.
wrong.
And
That's
as
wrong.
filmmakers, this is what changes the tide of any art form. When you just have that genius, for lack of a better word, that kind of comes in and breaks almost every rule.
Yep.
And
There's a
and
reason
makes
Citizen
it
Kane
perfect.
is considered the greatest film of all time, because Wells didn't care about adhering to anything. I mean, if he has to dig
Because he
6
cared-
feet
because
into
he
a hole
cared
to
so much,
point the
right?
camera, he's going to do what he's going to have to do.
Right, because
you
he
know?
cared so much.
Right.
That's the thing. You have to care.
But he also
more.
studied the greats, so that's
Right.
the thing. He's aware of theory, but he knows
You need to
that
break
he can
the
break
rules.
the rules.
Yeah.
Well, don't you remember that scene in Amadeus when
Yeah.
he's just showing off to the girls and he's playing Beethoven backwards or whatever?
I mean, that makes me think of Jerry Lee Lewis.
Yeah.
Like Great Balls of Fire. There's one that's not crazy good film, but at least, you know, it did have a pretty charismatic performance.
I thought it was a good film. I just thought it was like, oh, it's sweet. So we're gonna spend like this whole film focusing on this affair with like.
Right. Well, that's another one.
His
That's
cousin
it's
or
one of
whatever.
the biopics that really only it paints in broad strokes and doesn't really get to the heart of, you know.
Yeah, and that's not a good agenda for selling records either. You know.
Marrying your cousin who's 12.
Well, I'm saying, yeah, exactly. Well, I'm saying if you, because I feel like a lot of the biopics kind of come with this agenda of like, you know, hey, we'll sponsor that biopic and we'll give you all the music because we're really just trying to create a relevance and sell more records again. You know, the Doors movie really did turn an entire '90s generation on
Yeah.
to like this whole new thing. You know, and or back to this old thing, I guess you could say. But
You know, oh, go ahead.
No, go.
I was gonna say, I think we should talk about Head. You mentioned it. I think it's cool that the Monkees were pretty much ready to kind of like cash it in and be like, you know, let's just kind of like, you know, agreed to make this movie that really just like a send up of like not taking themselves too seriously and very satirical, and it was just it kind of shows you what you can do with, and it's sort of like, you know, a play off the Richard Lester Beatles movies. And
Well, there's a great, I don't know if you know this, but so Jack Nicholson wrote Head, and the producers had gone to him and said, and he's like, hey, I can write you, there's 2 movies I can write you. One, I have no doubt is going to be as successful as A Hard Day's Night. The other one isn't going to make a nickel. And the producer's like, I want the other one. And that's like Jack Nicholson telling us like, and he said, I want the other one. And I was like, what are you talking about?
yeah,
that's hysterical.
Yeah, it's a crazy movie.
it is. There's truly nothing like it. It's just some of the skits are just ridiculous. I mean, and they really had charisma. I mean, they did a great job in it.
You're just making me think of Spinal Tap, which we haven't hit yet.
Oh,
I
gee,
know.
Let's talk about Spinal Tap, and then let's talk about Muddy Wind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Spinal Tap is...
Perfect.
Yeah.
It feels weird to even talk about Spinal Tap sometimes because I feel like it's the definition of a cult classic. You know, this thing where I know what room I'm in by just dropping one of those quotes and seeing kind of who lights up a little bit.
Right.
And if nobody in the room lights up, then I'm
You're
like,
gonna leave. Yeah.
This is not my room.
No, this is not my scene.
I was gonna say I'm gonna listen. But yeah, because there are so many people, I can't believe how many people don't even know.
I mean, I was
Don't
late,
know
I was
the
late to the
movie?
party on it, to be honest.
Well, how about this? Or don't even know that it's not a real band. That is
Well,
one of my
that
favorite
too, but
parts.
I think there's also something about, again, you definitely nailed it with cult classic, but like, I just rewatched that movie a couple months ago, and just the level of quotability, like every 10 seconds is a line that you're like, oh yeah, I think about this all the time. And it isn't until you actually sit down and focus on it. I hadn't seen it in years again, you know. But like when you go through and you're like hit after hit after hit after hit, and every line lands, and every inside joke is like so perfectly executed from like the viewpoint of a musician, and like just the number of times that I've been in a venue where you get disoriented and it takes you back to that scene with like the custodian in the basement and they're like completely lost.
It made the Wayne's World films possible, to be
Yeah,
honest. It
right,
kind
yeah.
of lent
right.
to that energy, you know.
Yeah, and for me that makes me think of what's one of the craziest things about how that movie worked was that it is like an album with a great producer. Right? So you can have the most talented musicians in the world with the greatest songs, but you can ruin an album.
Oh, yeah.
So to me, I credit Rob Reiner 110% for being like, I'm gonna let these cats do their thing, and then I'm gonna lock them out, and I'm just gonna go and edit it and do my thing. But I'm gonna let them put it all down.
Yeah. Riff the
and
whole
then,
time, yeah.
You know, because it was his, wasn't it? It was his whole concept too, right? To just like completely improv and just, you know, because I think that's what, like, I actually always think about, I feel like I saw behind the scenes or something where they're talking about how they reference one of their really early songs when they're in the diner, and then they perform it, like getting on the train or so, whatever that thing is, and then they sing in the harmonies, and he's like, oh no, it was
That's the thing, man. Not only is it this like this comedy gem, like this trophy that you can hold up and say like this is what a great comedy can be, but it also says like it's a better film about musicians than a serious film about musicians.
And
right?
they're real, but they're real great musicians too. That's, I think, the thing that most people miss. Like, talk about perfection of playing the
Right.
actual thing. It's
Yeah.
like, no. They wrote those songs.
Yeah, they're
They played
actually
them.
playing
Wow.
them.
You know? And so,
I don't know if I knew that.
yeah, well, so this is what's so great, that they all are beyond competent musicians, but they took like the Randy Newman approach and like we're like, no, let's create. That's why Mighty Wind is even, it's like hysterical even in the timing of it, because it's like we were this metal band and now we're this
Exactly. Yeah, it's a full circle thing.
And how often do you see that? Or vice versa, you know what I mean? It's like,
underneath all the jokes and everything, there is this, like, they love the music, right? That's what's so great about A Mighty Wind, is that underneath it all, there really is this really sweet affection and love and respect,
right,
for this type of music. I mean, it's also just very damn funny. But I mean, that whole subplot in A Mighty Wind between Catherine O'Hara and Eugene Levy.
right.
I mean, for this crazy comedy, like off the wall madness, that's just a very sweet thing to drive your film to. This, is it going to happen? Is it
They
not gonna
always
happen?
have kind of this love. I mean, the love element in. I mean, maybe you disagree with me, but the love element to me in Spinal Tap is actually between David St. Hubbins and
Nigel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the love story.
Yeah.
We shan't be working together again.
We shan't. And I was thinking though, when you're talking about their love for the music and everything, I think what makes that so special is that the way they treat their love for music and what they do with it, their acumen of how to play and write, is exactly what they're doing with the art of acting.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, we can be straight, like we are solid actors, but this is actually what we do on in our trailer or on our tour bus after, and we kind of want to create 2 hours of this, because to us this is actually the funniest.
And that's where the power of the editing comes in, and I think that's where Reiner knew that you could make gold out of it.
Yeah, because no one ever really allowed that. It was kind of on lock. It's like, no, that's only behind the curtain. He was like, well, what if we kind of make it hokey, but
I think there were
curtain.
filmmakers doing that. I think Altman and Houston later would in the 70s would kind of have like a, allow for some improvisation and really trust their actors to kind of create kind of a natural. Cassavetes too had a process where they would actually improvise and then he would write a screenplay from the improvisation.
I mean it more though from the sarcasm.
Oh yeah.
To me, just the sarcasm. Because here's the thing, right? It's like maybe me and you were talking about this recently, but in jazz, you have this a lot, where you'll have the most incredible jazz solo on whatever instrument it is, and then they'll play like a lick real quick of like a classic joke song, and they'll just like throw it in there because it's kind of like the nod. And
groups play "Mary Had a Little Lamb" to come back to what it's like.
It's just a tip of the hat to kind of be like, yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
To me, that Spinal Tap and A Mighty Wind is like the whole movie is that they're like, no, we're such good actors and we're such good songwriters. Like, Big Bottom Woman, I don't know. I mean, like that, just the idea that they were where. I think about them like, where did this come from?
Everyone's playing bass.
Everyone's playing bass. Yeah. And the bass player's playing a double neck bass. I think they're both 4 strings, so there's not even a difference.
Point. Yeah.
But here's what's so funny about them as musicians and actors, they're like, no one's even gonna get it.
Yeah.
They're not even gonna know that this is the same instrument twice. So it's like, but yeah, I mean, because that's my favorite part about like what I was saying about like bringing the behind the curtain to the front. It's like that whole movie's an inside joke. Like when they walk into the party and they all have cold sores. They're probably I have to think that has to be from something they witnessed at like a Hollywood party and a band came through and they're like, did you notice? I bet you there's so much more of that is inside.
He had like 600 hours. They had 600 hours of footage that he had to get down to.
Who are you, Rob Reiner? I mean, because that's the I mean, I think about that with like really long books. You see like 1,000-page book.
Yeah, how long was the manuscript?
Right.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, that was a 5,000-page book. Like, I thing. I don't want to misquote or whatever. My wife always says she does a lot of writing, and she's always talking when I get attached to something. Kill your darlings. It's like, don't be scared to just, the thing that you think is the most important is you're probably just zoomed in too far.
Right.
And also like step out without fear and just get it all written out. Like don't belabor every little line. It's like, write 5,000 pages.
Right.
Just who cares? Just like
Write
you can go
100
back
songs.
in and exactly.
Narrow it down to 10.
Yeah.
You'll have like one good one.
Yes. That's all you need.
Yeah, that's all you need.
To get a biopic made about it.
That's
your
right.
career.
That's right.
But that actually is kind of hysterical too, to think about the fickle nature of kind of how, I've heard it said that the way any trend or thing is born, that you have creators, you have fans, and you have these things. It's called mops. Was the psychology of a fad or something in pop culture. This guy wrote this book that's based on that, and the creators are like, these really intense people. They kind of like have no money. They're doing it because they have to. They can't not create. Then you have the fans, which are, typically it might be a little bit of creators themselves, but mostly they're just like
Consumers,
well, they're not even consumers, they're fanatics, right? Because they don't have money either, but they go to every single thing when they find. Then you have, this is where the tipping point is, the mops. So those are the people that have all the money, but they see that it's kind of catching on, and they just want to be part of the scene, and they have all the expendable income. So
That's the art scene.
That's
That's
all pop culture.
That's
so,
how.
But then they
right.
say, then there's the sociopath who waits. And until there's enough mops, then the sociopath comes in and creates the diet or the light version. And that's what actually kills in the end.
Right.
So I was thinking about that because when you really think about that one song, it's a scene, until you have the sociopath who's really like, oh, I'm completely
They're just gonna
make
jump the shark.
a bajillion dollars on this.
I mean, how many times did hit songs get remade like 3 or 4 times? Who's the guy who did Scorpio? Dennis. There's a great musician. I forget his name right now. But he basically had a hit, and then there was like 3 or 4 versions called different things, and it's just
exactly the same.
and probably not their idea. It's just this,
Well, how many
their
movies
bosses
do that?
are like, right.
The movie. That's the thing. They're like, oh, the formula.
No, every movie is the
Armageddon,
original
Deep
idea.
Impact.
This is Spinal Tap. That is the best original idea. Has that been stolen?
They've made mockumentary type. I think that helped really birth the mockumentary.
And like Christopher Guest's entire career, really.
Yes, totally.
But hey, if it ain't broke.
Because we didn't mention, which it just made me think of, well, I guess you did because you said Tiny Dancer, but Almost Famous to me, and that's the Cameron Crowe deal, right? That's like supposed to be, is loosely, or is that?
That's his.
That was his
it's
journey.
his semi autobiographical account of him being a writer at Rolling Stone.
Right.
At such a young age.
Because that's another one where they just take, that and That Thing You Do. If you were really to do the, the breakdown of the journey, the hero's journey or whatever, the Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey breakdown, it's like, oh, there's all the archetypes, there's all, it's like, why does nature do that to us? It does seem to kind of always have that dynamic is just always going on with those archetypes.
I think that there's a lot of it, like some sort of magnetism that, like in various bands or whatever, like you get the certain personality. Certain people are more likely to behave a certain way. There are these cliches about like, oh, drummers are like this, blah blah blah, like this. But I was just reading this thing about Van Halen the other day, and it was really funny. And it was talking about how David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen hated each other, and Eddie's quote at the time was, David Lee Roth is a rock star. I'm a musician. And so because Dave was such a jerk and showboating and taking over all the attention, it forced Eddie Van Halen to step up his game and get nastier at guitar and play faster and faster.
Right.
And it was like the two kind of fighting each other
Jimmy Page,
for
Robert
attention.
Plant.
Exactly. Lennon and McCartney. It's like it's the one-upmanship that is like kind of an innate thing as a performer, that you do want to be noticed and you do want to get better or whatever.
I'm reading a book called To the Break of Dawn right now about hip-hop, and it's talks about how Chuck D's political consciousness would not have been what it was without Flavor Flav
100%.
to kind of counterweight that, you know?
He was kind of the bullhorn,
Right.
you know, and it might have not been as effective if it wasn't. You kind of need. I love that about Flav. How he pretty much. I think one of his angles was the "I'm crazy, so listen or don't." You know, that's been an amazing.
Well, he was a
thing
little
that
like Old Dirty Bastard, where he just did whatever he wanted. Like, there was no.
But there's a
adherence.
safety net there, right? Like if you say really radical things, but you do it in a disguise or whatever as like, oh, I'm just crazy.
Right.
You know?
You can
then
get away with it,
You
yeah.
can really
Yeah.
get away with
Andy
so
Kaufman.
much
Yeah.
more. Totally.
You know? I
Totally.
think we might be
Are we there?
there.
Cool.
Well, I could just keep going.
I know.
Talk about this all day.
Thank you both.
Hey,
Yeah,
thank
that was
you.
awesome,
This
guys.
is awesome.
It was great listening to the three of you and your perspectives on this. And it's something that, you know, for Devin and I as film lovers, you know, music's a big topic of discussion when we have these shows. So it's great to have you guys come in here and talk about it even more.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for having us.
All right, so this was a special one-off that we're going to do from time to time, but we will be back in September with season 6. And for right now, thank you very much for joining us.